take over. So Boris, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Larissa. And also from my side, a warm welcome to this session, the system conversion and overview. Larissa has mentioned I'm working as a product manager in the area where the software update manager is located. We will learn about this tool in the context of the system conversion. And I'm doing presentations mainly on system conversion and software update manager tasks. Today, the agenda for you contains 3 sections. We start with the system conversion as a one-step transition, one scenario out of 3, and we have a look on the S/4HANA target versions and the source requirements, the source system to be converted to SAP S/4HANA. Afterwards, we'll have a look why it is important to note that SAP S/4HANA is different to the source system, SAP ERP. And then finally, we'll have a look at the technical conversion implementation, where the software update manager or some tool is relevant and data conversion will be discussed. So starting, of course, with system conversion, a one-step transition, as we say. Overall, you know that the transition to SAP S/4HANA can be achieved with 3 different approaches. You see in the middle, the transition option system conversion. That is what we're going to focus on today in this session. We also have the selective data transition, and we have the new implementation. Those are usually the 3 scenarios listed. And you see as a target for a system conversion, it is either SAP S/4HANA, which means somehow the on-premise version, or SAP S/4HANA Cloud Private Edition. It's an approach where we reuse the source system, the data, and part of the customizing, and it allows us to start a rapid modernization into the new world of SAP S/4HANA. This is my summary of the 3 transition scenarios. So we start with an SAP ERP 6.0 system. So if your source system is an SAP ERP 6.0 system, and the enhancement package level is not relevant, then it is possible to execute the conversion to SAP S/4HANA in one step. This is possible independent on whether your source system is already running on SAP HANA database or any other of the supported database types we have in the classical ERP world. And we target, as mentioned, the SAP S/4HANA on-premise software or product version, which of course is always running on HANA database, so SAP HANA 2.0. The latest available release is 2023. And this is the main information about the one-step transition. So it is required that the source system is already on a Unicode. That is a story that SAP has laid out years ago. So requirement for the source system, it has to be ERP 6.0 with or without enhancement packages. It has to be Unicode, and it has to be an ABAP single stack. What does it mean? Dual stack systems like we had before running ABAP, like ERP and Portal, Java, together on one database with one database ID is not supported. So in case your source system is still a dual stack, you'll have to do the dual stack split before. No big deal. And if your source system is non-Unicode, you'll have a separate small project to convert to Unicode before. Just to mention it again explicitly, it is not required that the source system is already running on SAP HANA database. So any of those supported databases are fine for a one-step transition. The requirements for the respective target are listed in an SAP node. You see here the SAP node listed on the slide. Concerning the target system, I've listed 2023, that's the latest available release, and SAP S/4HANA 2023 is based on the ABAP platform 2023. I just mentioned this because SAP S/4HANA is not based on what we called SAP NetWeaver. SAP NetWeaver is more than the ABAP stack, of course. SAP S/4HANA is based on ABAP, but not on SAP NetWeaver. It's based on what we call the ABAP platform. And concerning operating systems, compared to the old world of the business suite, there is a change in the coverage of the operating systems. That's the case since quite some years, as you can imagine, based on the name of our platform, 1809. Now, a similar picture shown here for the conversion path. So we call this a conversion. It's a conversion from the old world, an ERP system to be more precise, and it's converting to a new product line. It's not an update, it's not an upgrade. First of all, from the legal perspective, because SAP S/4HANA is a different product family. And from the technical perspective, it's more, the project is more effort compared to an update upgrade inside the classical business suite. I've listed 2023. You know, we have a release, SAP S/4HANA releases since quite a while. Just let me again emphasize that the conversion is targeting either SAP S/4HANA on-premise or S/4HANA Cloud Private Edition, but we do not target SAP S/4HANA Cloud. The releases are listed here. Now you see the history of all those releases. The releases written in bold, those are those that we would recommend. And even 2021 is still possible, but not recommended concerning the versions there. Now, there are the early members of the S/4HANA family that is called SAP S/4HANA Finance 1605 or even SAP Simple Finance 1503. Of course, they are not a valid target for a conversion, but if you have a source system on those releases targeting S/4HANA, the full-blown solution is what we call a conversion as well. And again, we call this a conversion because it's the transition to a new product line, a new product family. And on the other hand, we call this a conversion because SAP S/4HANA comes with a new data model as well on the database. There are lots of simplifications, and also on database level, we have a new data model. That means that we will have to work on the data in the transitioning to SAP S/4HANA. That's the other reason why we call this a conversion. Now, a short repetition, what was already laid out in the session called Exploring the Basics of SAP S/4HANA. The session took place this year, end of April, is concerning the release strategy, first of all. So you know, concerning the release strategy, we had a major release each year, but now we switched to a 2-year cycle. The next major release will be 2025. And in between, we have what we call feature package stacks. You see those little triangles there, feature package stacks. That's a repetition on the release strategy. Also mentioned in this session was the topic of simplification items. S/4HANA is different compared to SAP ERP, and the things that are different are described in what we call simplification items. There's a long list that you can browse either in a PDF or as a browser-based kind of catalog you see here. And all those items describe what is changed. There are some functionality that are no longer available. If in the ERP world we have different solutions for the same topic, this is now put into one strategic direction. And those simplification items also describe what to do before executing the conversion. Famous example is the customer vendor integration, the introduction of the business partner. This concept was already existing in SAP ERP. It was optional, but now with SAP S/4HANA, it's mandatory. Especially, it's mandatory to have the business partner already in the source system. That is a famous example for a simplification item. So this is described. Each item describes what has changed, what is new, and references an SAP node and explains the concept behind. That is important to know, just as a repetition. Finishing up the repetition with the compatibility packs. That is important because in the beginning, we had some functionality that was existing in SAP ERP that was still able to be used in SAP S/4HANA because the redesign did not happen yet. So to be more precise, legally you were allowed for a specific restricted time period to use this. Meanwhile, we have adapted all this, so those compatibility packs will run out of maintenance end of next year. So this has to be considered as part of the project as well. Referencing a community blog here and referencing the session where this was already explained out there. So as a kind of repetition, now what I show you now on this one-step transition is a usual picture that you will also find in the conversion guide. But where do you find the conversion guide? Well, you enter help.sap.com/s for HANA. This will always direct you to the latest release of SAP S/4HANA, in this case 2023, or obviously you select the tab Implement, and there you find a link to the conversion guide, and on page 11 you will find exactly this picture that shows we have a preparation phase there, we have a realization phase. In the preparation phase, things like system requirements are important. That includes, for example, source system has to be ERP 6.0 with or without enhancement packages, things like this. And in this session, we'll have a short look on the maintenance planner, what the role of this well-known tool is in the context of a conversion. The simplification items already mentioned, they have checks to be considered. Custom code is important. If the data model changes, your own coding will have to be adapted. Most probably, you'll find guidance on this. And this is somehow embedded by what we call the simplification list. The realization phase, the real technical conversion is executed by the software update manager, and there are some post activities to be considered as well. This picture will follow us throughout the presentation. That was the one-step transition. It is possible to convert in one step if the source system is ERP 6.0, is Unicode, and an ABAP single stack. Now, why is it important to point out SAP S/4HANA is different? That is now explained in the second section here. Again, same picture here with the tools that we'll have a look on, and SAP S/4HANA is different compared to the source system ERP 6.0. The difference is, for example, on component level. We have software components, you know this. SAP ERP contains SAP Basis, contains SAP HR. Those are software components, and the software component architecture of SAP S/4HANA is different. That is considered by the maintenance planner. Now, SAP S/4HANA is different on customizing level. You know the example, customer vendor integration, many others. This is a difference on customizing level, and this is described by the simplification items, and this is checked obviously by the respective check. Then the development objects level is different. You can imagine if we have changed software components, we have different database types, different objects in ABAP, then your custom code will have to be adapted to the new model as well. And this is considered in the section on custom code preparation. All this is concluded by software and database level is different. So if your source system is not running on SAP HANA database, obviously the migration to SAP S/4HANA has to be part of the conversion execution guided by the software update manager. The first three are related to the SAP Readiness Check. The SAP Readiness Check is an important check that you should execute as soon as possible if you consider using the conversion as a methodology to SAP S/4HANA. So the SAP Readiness Check is the foundation for planning. The Readiness Check as such comes with those tiles, those Fiori tiles, and contains a lot of information about checks that are relevant for your source system. The background is that you run specific checks in your source system. Those checks are producing output. You upload the output to the SAP Readiness Check, and then you'll get the results here for all those aspects that are to be considered in your project. So it's a good idea to start very early to get a rough understanding on the major aspects to be considered in your project. So it contains the simplification items. Again, I mentioned the example of customer vendor integration, but also add-ons, especially non-SAP add-ons. It's important to notify you early about existing add-ons, because if you want to keep them, you have to have a version of those add-ons that are compatible with the target SAP S/4HANA version. Yeah? Sizing is important. Interfaces, be it iDocs, be it remote function calls, whatever. Downtime for the conversion as such can be calculated inside the readiness check. So there's lots of checks. The usage of the readiness check is part of the standard license, so no additional costs. You can even repeat this, and you can start your project planning with this. Very important. It is technically not required to execute the SAP readiness check, but it's strongly recommended. And you will see that the readiness check has some overlap with other checks that we'll have a look on. But the benefit of the readiness check is always it has this holistic view. It's this comprehensive collection of all the information that you need to know. Where do you find information about the SAP Readiness Check? Also with help.sap.com S/4HANA implement, and then there's the link to the SAP Readiness Check. What is non-SAP add-on? Well, an add-on is functionality that is bundled in what we call an add-on. This can be provided by SAP, and it can be provided by any third-party vendor. And that's what we call add-on. This add-on may have interfaces and may be related to integration, but the crucial part is an add-on is made out of ABAP functionality, and this ABAP functionality must fit to the new data model of SAP S/4HANA. That's why it's important. You need a version, a release of this add-on that is available and certified for the target version. And especially if it's non-SAP, then you'll have to contact your add-on provisioning partner if they already have a version. That's why I've mentioned this here. Now, one of those tools that is partially covered by the SAP Readiness Check is the maintenance planner. It is the tool for planning. In former times, we have used the maintenance optimizer. Some of you may know the word MOPS there, but it's now the maintenance planner as a kind of cloud service. And this is the new user interface here where you can plan for SAP S/4HANA. The maintenance planner has two sections. First of all, you check your source system, whether it's capable to be converted. And this check for the source system is especially for add-ons and business functions. There are some restrictions concerning business functions, and add-ons, again, is important to check before. For this early check, you do not need an SAP S/4HANA license yet. You can run this check in the maintenance planner without having the S/4HANA license yet. That's why we recommend to do this very early. But again, this check is exactly the same check that the SAP Readiness Check is doing. So why not using the Readiness Check? After you found out your source system is ready to be converted, you can do the second step, planning for conversion. That means that the required software components are calculated so that the tool can provide the software archives later for the software update manager to update this system, and what we call the stack XML. That's a kind of recipe for the software update manager, so the tool knows what to do. For the software archives, the backend and front-end server are considered. Well, what is front-end server? That's the SAP Fiori software, basic user interface paradigm of SAP S/4HANA now is SAP Fiori. All part of the calculation in the maintenance planner. For those add-ons that can be uninstalled, that's a requirement, meanwhile, for third-party add-ons. Those add-ons that can be uninstalled, you can use the maintenance planner to plan the uninstallation. But this is rather a technical information. I think it's more important to consider, do you need this add-on still? Or is there functionality delivered by the standard SAP S/4HANA so that you have a business reason not to use the add-on any longer? But technically, if you want to uninstall the add-on, this can be planned in the maintenance planner and will be realized later by the software update manager. Again, important warning, third-party add-ons to be checked in time. The experience from the projects we have seen is if there is an add-on that is not yet supported, this may delay your project plan. That's why, again, important to check very early, for example, using the SAP Readiness Check. So Maintenance Planner is one of those checks you will have to execute anyhow. And part of this, the check of the Maintenance Planner, is part of the SAP Readiness Check. Now coming to a little screenshot. In the Maintenance Planner, you plan for SAP S/4HANA, you will run a manual conversion, and you select your source system, the target version, and then you decide to co-deploy with the backend, and then you can run it. Now about the simplification items here, already mentioned, there's a check that you can run in your source system. Let's cut it short. And this will, first of all, check whether the simplification item check is relevant for your system, because a check is always belonging to a component. If you do not have the component, the check is not relevant. If it's relevant, then it has to be green. So the system has to be consistent. If you did not run the customer vendor integration yet, this item will be red, and a red simplification item will block the conversion. You cannot execute the conversion since the software update manager will run exactly the same check during the technical conversion. And then if there's a red flag, you did not implement one of those required implementation customizings, the tool will stop. So that is important. That belongs to the long list of the simplification items, but the check will shrink down this list to those items that are relevant for your particular source system. That's important. The simplification item list is a long list, but only part of those is relevant for your source system. You use this check, and then you know exactly what to do in your system there. That now finishes up with the custom code preparation. I already mentioned the data model changes of SAP S/4HANA, so your coding has to adapt to new new database tables, has to adapt to new SAP objects, new function models, whatsoever. So first of all, we recommend scoping to see what of your coding is still relevant, what of your coding is used. If there's coding that is not used, don't adapt it, just get away from it. And you can use the SAP Fiori app that allows you to do the scoping, and then you can let the software update manager even remove unused code that you have put out of scope. And then custom code analysis. The tools will provide easy hints to adapt your coding. For example, one of those simplification items is the length of the material field. Material number field has changed from 18 to 40, has to be potentially adapted in your code. And then quick fixes that help you to adapt this. The adaptation will be done after we have converted your development system to SAP S/4HANA, because only then you have the new data model, of course, and afterwards always custom code optimization is recommended. You find the custom code migration guide here in SAP S/4HANA help.com, and I'll keep this short because we have a dedicated session on custom code. You see the date here that you should consider. Short remark on SAP Fiori as the user experience. You find information on this in the help area as well. It is the area where your business user can consume the innovations that come with SAP S/4HANA. You do not immediately have to switch to SAP Fiori, but if you do not use those new applications and the new interface, the question is, well, what's the benefit for end users? So it's strongly recommended. Finishing up with a technical conversion. Again, the software update manager is the tool here. And the software update manager does what the tool name says. It's updating the software components. It will run part of the data conversion from the old data model to the new data model. And if required, it will also do the database migration. If the source is already on HANA database, it will be kept. If the source is on non-HANA database, the tool will run the database migration to SAP S/4HANA. Special remark now, if you want to move the system, or especially if you are taking part in RISE with SAP, moving your system to the SAP cloud environment, then the Software Update Manager has two approaches listed here that are very handy to be used. And we have a dedicated session on this as well. Important aspects when transforming to SAP S/4HANA Cloud Private Edition, where we discuss those two approaches for a transition as part of RISE with SAP. Concerning custom code, I see the question, SAP BTP is not strongly correlated to the custom code adaptation as you adapt your coding in the ECC system to the coding used in SAP S/4HANA. There is some relation because this SAP Fiori app that I did not really explain is running in the ABAP environment of the BTP. So the Software Update Manager has tasks, and a short look on what the requirement is. The Software Update Manager needs the stack XML that is provided by the maintenance planner. Remember, you plan in the maintenance planner the conversion that will provide the output, the software archives that the Software Update Manager will use, and the stack XML. So without planning the maintenance planner, the tool cannot start. The simplification items that you should run manually will be executed by the Software Update Manager, but of course you should have solved all issues before. Otherwise you will run in trouble and may delay your project. Optional activities, I already mentioned. Readiness check is technically not required, but strongly recommended. Custom code check is of course relevant for your productive system, but for the first sandbox run, you can ignore it, especially since you adapt the custom code only after the conversion. So you do it really after the conversion of your development system. And the Software Update Manager has an important check, prerequisite check extended, that allows you to somehow execute specific phases without really doing the conversion, but collecting all the major blockers that may show up to have a plan to solve them. That is important. The prerequisite check extended is, of course, described in the conversion guide of the Software Update Manager, and you see the link here where to find this. There is the question on SAP HCM for SAP S/4HANA concerning the technical conversion that I'm describing here. There is no specific thing to consider. That is rather on customizing level. So there are specific customizing settings you have to consider, which are, of course, documented, but the overall conversion idea is the same. The Software Update Manager has specific phases. We see here in green, there's a pre-processing or uptime processing. Uptime means end users are still working on the system. This phase is much longer than shown here. The tool has its own technology like shadow system to already execute things in uptime to reduce downtime. And then in the downtime, the Software Update Manager has a migration part. If source is not yet on SAP HANA, or if we move between infrastructures. There's this update part concerning the components, and there is the data conversion part. You see this is part of the Software Update Manager as well, but only partially, since after the Software Update Manager, actually the data from Fin and Material Ledger are converted. Important thing. Software Update Manager is the main engine for the conversion, but it's not everything that is related to downtime. So there are activities that have to be executed on the kind of intermediate S/4HANA system after the Software Update Manager has finished, IMG activities. So configure the new Fin customizing, run the Fin data migration, and then some post activities. So this is relevant for the downtime. The overall technical downtime is not only the Software Update Manager, but also the Fin and Material Ledger data conversion, very important. And of course, for your project, it's more important to talk about the business downtime. We tell the business downtime is the time during which the end users are not able to log onto the system, not able to work. So whenever you talk about downtime in your project with your colleagues, with consultants, with SAP, be specific which part you are referring to. Business downtime is the overall downtime there. That is concerning the phases and blocks of the software update manager. We have a dedicated session on this as well, mid of October. Important to mention concerning data validation, we have a tool now. There are SAP services as well for business data validation, but meanwhile, we have a tool that is available as part of the standard license that can be used to compare your business data. So you do a kind of snapshot, photography of the data before the conversion and afterwards, and then you can use the tool to automatically compare. The benefit of the tool is it's a framework. It allows a fast comparison of data instead of manual spot checks. It's much faster. This is what we recommend. And then also important to mention, we have the ASU Toolbox, Application Conversion Assistant. It's a collection of information, guides, conversion tool that you can use as well as a kind of task list to be used here. And the content for this framework is shipped as an XML document, and you see the references for those SAP notes. That was a fast go through. I wanted to have some time for questions before we turn to the questions. This session gave a short overview on the requirements for system conversion, like source system, ERP 6.0, Unicode, ABAP single stack, tools, SAP Readiness Check, very important to use. That's why we advertise this. We have different tools with different focuses, maintenance planner on the components, simplification item checks on customizing, custom code, check for the custom code, and then the aspects for the execution, like software update manager is doing a major thing, but there are things afterwards, IMG activities, especially fin and material ledger data. In the material, you will find an appendix with advertising a book where I had the honor to contribute that is not only focusing on the conversion, but on other scenarios as well. And not to forget a link to free SAP learning offerings. You may know our open SAP content was meanwhile migrated to learning.sap.com. So it's important to have a look there as well with lots of details produced by our experts like the Regional Implementation Group. Now let's turn to the questions. There are some. Is it really recommended to do all custom code adaptation after the upgrade of the development system? Or does this only apply to the data model specific adaptations, while the general ABAP ones could be done in advance? Of course, you have to have a specific look to the details, and it's great to have our expert Olga. She will be talking about custom code. There are some things that you can do beforehand, some things that are related to the HANA database, and other things that are related to the new data model. Things that are related to the new data model can only be adapted after the conversion of the development system, since only then the new objects are there. Of course, in general, you are right. You have to distinguish. I did not really explain those differences here in detail. Thank you for asking. I'll ignore the question on the slide deck. I mentioned for the preparation phase, S/4HANA license is not required. It is not required for the SAP Readiness Check. It is not required for the maintenance planner checking the system. These are the two things you can do very early. As soon as you want to plan the conversion in the maintenance planner, you need the S/4HANA license. Only then the maintenance planner can provide the archives. And you need those archives to run the software update manager. So those are things where you need the SAP S/4HANA license. After the conversion, how to ensure that the S/4HANA system is compliant with the latest enhancement and updates from SAP? Well, you are planning the conversion in the maintenance planner, and this will ensure that all the enhancements that are required are part of the conversion, if I got your question correct. Yeah, so from the technical perspective, it is the maintenance planner that will provide all necessary things. And then, of course, there is the conversion guide that will provide additional information and the simplification items that tell you what to customize, things divided into customizing before you execute the conversion, like customer vendor integration. Some things can be done afterwards. That's, of course, also part of the work list to be considered. The sizing of SAP S/4HANA has to be considered in the planning phase, and that's why it's important that the SAP Readiness Check offers this sizing guide where you can even simulate. My database size is, let's say, 5 terabyte. If I would archive now this percentage, and archived data will not be converted, so it's even less downtime, what this would refer to. So this is my answer on the sizing. Of course, there's the usual sizing guide that is considering SAP S/4HANA as well. During data conversion, can any mappings be applied? No, in the sense of mapping, you define your own mapping, convert company code 1000 to company code 2000. This is not possible. Thank you for asking. The system conversion is a one-to-one conversion. So there is some data conversion defined by SAP, but you cannot define your own data mapping. And DTV, the data transition validation tool, is checking that the data have not been wrongly changed during the conversion. Let's put it like this. The usual case, based on the experience with data transition validation, is there is a mismatch and you find out that someone has adapted the system in a phase where this was not allowed. Yeah, that is a small hint on DTV. Yeah, so no own mapping for system conversion. Core clean or clean core. I assume that Olga will spend some words on clean core and the custom code adaptation. That is my hint for clean core in this short time frame. So an example, 55 simplification items. How do I plan it properly and estimate the effort? That is a good point. If we look at the simplification items, we have to be open and say, well, there are some simplification items that are rather small. If you read the respective SAP note, it says, well, you start this report and it will adapt some data within minutes. Okay, quickly done. Other simplification items are a small project like customer vendor integration that may take essential time. That's why it's important for you to know very early. Of course, with only the number 55, we cannot estimate the effort, but the SAP Readiness Check has an answer for this, because meanwhile, the SAP Readiness Check will also guess the granularity of those simplification items. That's why this is the point where I would start with the effort estimation. What's the learning sub-course name on this topic? There are several on this topic. So I've listed one here, one URL, and there are others as well. So there's a variety of learnings, meanwhile, which are based on this open SAP courses that have been developed the previous years. So scroll through it and you'll find this. That is fine. And then, thank you for the feedback. I do not see this as a question. Do you have any suggestions to minimize the downtime during the conversion? Visit my next session, reducing the downtime. There are options inside the software update manager to reduce the downtime, and we will discuss this from the easy answer, archive data if possible. That will reduce the downtime, up to very sophisticated technologies that move execution paths to uptime already. with data handling and so that is part of my separate session, reduce the downtime for a conversion. There is methodology nowadays by other service providers which modify data during conversion, known as Bluefield conversion. At what point they perform this task? They do perform this task during the part. See all slides. Let's go back to the starting point. There are 3 transition scenarios. I've been talking about the system conversion, which is a one-to-one relationship, one ERP source system, one SAP S/4HANA target system. All that's in the source system will be converted. Apart from the data that you archive first, the archive is extracted and can still be accessed later by the S/4HANA, but you reduce downtime. But during this, there is no mapping. Now your question is something like Bluefield. This is the area of selective data transition. So you can say system conversion is sometimes referred to as brownfield. The new implementation is called greenfield, and the thing in between is what we call selective data transition. Bluefield is one name of one specific partner. It's not a generic term. There's even orange field and others. So let's talk generic. There are partners that offer their own selective data transition, and they offer to extract only part of the data, to select, to cut out parts of the source system during the transition. Again, with the system conversion, that is not possible. And they allow to do mapping. They will move only part of the data and do specific mappings while the data are transferred. Of course, that's a very simple explanation here, but I guess that should help you for the starting of understanding this technology here. So selective data transition, and let me add, it's not only partners that offer selective data transition. There are some partners, but SAP is offering our own selective data transition service. And since May this year, we even have a lean SDT, a lean selective data transition from SAP that is part of the standard. So you can use the cloud ALM to define a project, to define, for example, which custom codes you would like to migrate. And this is what we call lean SDT as part of the BTC Business Transformation Center. There are separate sessions on this as well. So let me check again if there's a question open. Is there a link with common customer learnings on system conversion projects? As far as I remember, Larissa, we have a separate session on this. Lessons learned from projects provided by the regional implementation group. So please check the list of sessions. There should be one for this.
Right. I've actually posted the link to the assets of the all session that were conducted so far, but I will then pick a dedicated session of the regional implementation group and can share it in a moment.
Fine. And for everyone, thank you for your questions, everyone.
Maybe there are some more participants who are just typing the question, because now we still have a little bit of time. So now is the chance to interact with Boris and get the answers directly from him. Here I have a session's lessons learned. 1 second. I will then share it immediately. All right. I can't see more questions in the chat. And also no more questions via Q&A tool. First of all, thank you, Boris, for your presentation, for sharing all these details. And the question that was asked several times, the materials of today's session, the video itself and the PDF will be available probably tomorrow under the dedicated playlist on YouTube. I've already posted the link several times in the chat, so please check it out. I would say tomorrow because we would need some time to upload the assets, and they also have to go through a certain process connected to compliance. So for this reason, please check it tomorrow, and there will be all the materials and all the links that Boris have shared in today's session. With this, thank you very much for all the applause and for all these positive reactions. So the credit goes to Boris. And of course, today was the overview session, and there will be more to come. Next week on Tuesday, we will have Olga with all the details around custom code. So please join us next week. I will send out a reminder, as always, to all the registered participants. So we hope to welcome you live next week. And the session that Boris will deliver in October, they are also included in the PDF. So you can already put the reminder in your calendar and join us on October 15 and October 22nd. So with this, again, thank you very much. Thank you for all the positive feedback that you give us. Always welcome and great to have you live in our sessions, because this is actually the essence of this series, to have the live interaction. For this, I appreciate you dedicating your time to be with us. With this, again, thank you very much, and bye-bye, and hope to see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.